It's always very important for us to look at the end user as we talk about within sort of the IT space. And for all of us, or for most of us who are here, the end user are the students who we go and support every single day, which is why we're all here pretty much in the positions that we hold. And so we're really excited to kind of capstone today with a couple student leaders from post-secondary members that exist here as well too. So first, I'm actually going to introduce Shifra Gadasetti. And she holds a Bachelor of Nursing and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology with a minor of Women's Studies and Gender Studies. She's recognized as a fierce advocate for education, both locally and internationally, leading teams involving government relations, policy development, along senior administrators, elected officials, and large stakeholders. She's currently completing her Master's in Political Management at Carleton University, great university, I must say. And she even served as the former president of Mount Royal University. So I will pass it on to her to carry on the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Graham. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks, everyone. And I'll take a moment before we jump in to introduce our panelists currently. So Abner Monteiro is the Vice President Academic at the University of Alberta Students' Union. He is a kinesiology student with a passion for student governance and exercise science. And his passion for motion learning has led him to research perceptual motor behavior and promote health and wellness, both inside and outside of the U of A community. So welcome, Abner. I'll give you a couple minutes maybe to speak a little bit more about your work and your role, and then we'll go on and introduce Nicole.
Sure. Am I muted? Can you hear me, Nicole?
I can. You're good.
Okay, perfect. That means I'm unmuted. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Abner, Vice President Academic of the Students' Union. I use he, him pronouns. My role primarily is to do, I'm the primary spokesperson for academic advocacy here at the Students' Union, advocating for over 34,000 undergraduate students. Most of the issues I deal with are academic related, some campus life related. A lot of the challenges that have come up this year for students academically have been around online learning. So I'm here to share some of those insights, and I'm really excited to be here.
Lovely. And Nicole is up next. She is the president of the University of Calgary Students' Union and a student in the Faculty of Arts, pursuing dual undergraduate degrees in political science and international relations. She's also a member of the U of C's Arts and Sciences Honors Academy and the Faculty of Arts Co-op program. And she has completed a year-long cooperative education term with the Office of Leadership and Student Engagement through the U of C, where she's worked to recruit student volunteers, facilitate student programming, and work collaboratively with non-for-profit organizations in Calgary. Thank you for joining us, Nicole.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Very excited to be here today. So just to speak a little bit more to my role, I am currently the president of the Students' Union here at the University of Calgary. So I work with our team of staff and executives to engage in a number of ongoing issues of concern here for students, both internally at the university and externally. Part of my role is person for the Students' Union here at the U of C. So I get to do a lot of advocacy to all levels of government, both municipal. Some issues that we've been dealing with so far this year have surrounded mental health concerns, sexual violence on campus, and also tuition increases, both regular and exceptional tuition increases, which are a special type of tuition increases that we have here in Alberta. So I've gotten the opportunity to do a lot of advocacy on that. But yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Okay, I think I get to keep my camera on now. I seem to be having some interesting background issues. You're all exposed to the chaos that is my life, but that is the life of a grad student. Enough about me. Before we move on, we have a few questions prepared, but I did want to encourage folks to drop their questions in the chat and submit them, and we'd love to get to them throughout our panel. So let us start with some questions about, I guess, the transition from, primarily in-person learning to virtual learning. And either one of you can go first. Let's start with, what are some of the major disruptions that you've seen over the last 20 months when it comes to your experiences as students and as advocates in post-secondary?
Do you want to start?
If you want to start us off, I'm good with that. Sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. Jafre, you said primary disruptions that we've seen over the last. Okay, sure. Yeah, so I mean, over the last year, almost 2 years now, I think one of the primary disruptions we've seen is one, the introduction of online learning, but also the transition from online learning to being in a hybrid learning format. So at the University of Alberta, we went from being primarily online, all our courses being online, to having 80% of our courses be in person and 20% of our courses being online. And initially, the online learning aspect of that, there were a lot of challenges with a lot of students who were international students and couldn't be here, students who were on reserve and didn't have a strong internet connection, but also students who were in rural areas and didn't have an internet connection. So online learning provided its challenges there with students who had participation grades and weren't able to be in those classes. So they were, it was affecting their grades, affecting their ability to be in class, assessments that they needed to do and not being sure if the internet was going to cut out. Very stressful for them. And then as we transitioned to being in person, there were a lot of classes that were offered for students because of the limited amount of resources that we had, where instructors had to choose between offering a course online or offering a course in person. So how we were able to make sure that students felt comfortable being in the classroom with the limited space that we had, and making sure they could still get their education, but also the students who may have had a medical exemption or were really scared to come to class because they had other family members who were and the word is slipping me. But basically they just weren't able to because they were immunocompromised. There's the word. Immunocompromised folk in their family who made them nervous to want to go to class, and trying to figure out alternatives to be able to, get those lectures to them, to be able to stream things live, live lecture capture, those sorts of things. Those have been the biggest challenges in finding accommodations for students as well.
Absolutely. I completely agree with all of that. I think we've had very similar conditions here for that transition from in-person learning to online, and then back again now from online to in-person. So I know when the pandemic first started, post-secondary institutions had to adjust very quickly to that shift to online learning. That's something that obviously students understand, but here at the University of Calgary, as I think with most institutions in Canada, it was not a smooth process at the beginning to make online learning work. Professors and both for students. So with that, there's obviously been a few issues that students have faced as a result with the switch to online learning, and then the switch once again back to in-person learning now this fall. So I think firstly, with online learning in general throughout the pandemic, we've heard from students that by and large, it wasn't working for them. A lot of students did thrive in that online learning environment, but most said that they missed the social aspect of that university experience once they moved online. I think, a lot of students, when they sign up for post-secondary, they really expect to get that sort of, quintessential university experience with all of those social interactions with their peers and their professors. So we were really hearing from students overall that they missed that social interaction and they missed that social aspect of university. And I think, there's so much more to university than just taking classes. So students really missed out on sort of those interactions when they were learning purely online. I think it's also worth noting too that students signed up for and paid for in-person learning. So one of the concerns that we were hearing from students overall is that they didn't feel that they were getting their money's worth with what we were hearing from students is Zoom University, just getting all of their courses delivered through an online learning format. So I'd say overall, at the start of the pandemic, that was definitely, I think, the biggest challenge for students that they faced, but also for the Students' Union was, really making that argument to the administration that students, do need to see their money's worth from post-secondary education, but they also need those opportunities for social interaction with their peers and their professors. So yeah, I'd say overall, that was definitely one of the biggest challenges when we first switched to online learning.
I can emphasize for sure. It's definitely been a while since I've been with Students' Union, but I am always inspired by the way you folks find, the best possible outcome and advocate for students' needs. And you've mentioned challenges in both of your responses, and definitely there are tons. But I'd also be curious to know if throughout this entire experience, to what extent, if any, has the increase in online learning improved accessibility? Because it seems like a lot of things that maybe seemed like, challenging accommodations or things we'd never done before for students now almost are the norm and offered for students regardless of whether or not they need them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe Nicole can start us off this time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say that that's actually been one of the biggest and sort of most surprising positives to come out of the pandemic is sort of the increase in accessibility of post-secondary education for students. Specifically, I'd say the largest demographic of students that we're hearing from is international students who historically had to incur, really large expenses to actually travel to Calgary to be here to attend their in-person classes. But now they have the opportunity to attend classes online from at home. Also, we've heard from students who are immunocompromised or who have other, immunodeficiency or sort of health-related conditions that might have prevented them from, being on campus or from taking as many courses or as fulsome of a course load historically as other traditional learners. So we're really hearing from those students who have benefited from the option to have online courses. That's definitely been a really big positive overall. Another positive that we've heard from students is actually related to the practice of exam proctoring, which historically was something that I know a lot of universities in Alberta and in Canada didn't really have a concrete policy around. So here at the University of Calgary, we actually advocated to the university, Students' Union advocated to the university to ban the practice of exam proctoring. And we were successful in doing so. It's actually embedded in university policy now, but we still estimate that around 8% of our courses still use it, which is troublesome because it creates a number of issues. It assumes that all students want to, cheat on exams, and it also shows a higher rate of red flags for cheating among BIPOC students, which is so that's definitely something that we wanted to look at, preventing. Also, too, there's students who need some flexibility, especially when learning online or at home, who need sort of that flexibility when taking an exam. So I'd say policy-wise, that was actually one of the Students' Union's biggest successes to come out of the pandemic, is actually getting exam proctoring banned because it unfairly discriminated against certain groups of students. So, while the pandemic has been incredibly challenging for post-secondary students overall, there have been a few positives to come out of it, which have been very encouraging.
Sure, and I can jump in to add to what Nicole was saying. She brought up two very good points around international students being able to have enhanced access to get their education here in Canada, and also online proctoring as well. It's been a big challenge for us here at the U of A too. Also trying to make a similar push to what the U of C did and follow suit with them to ban online proctoring. And I faced our own challenges, but continue to try to do that. But I think another really interesting element of this is looking at universal design. And I think one thing around accessibility that's really come to light is that there are a lot of students in the past, and now we're really seeing it here when we come back in person with the budget cuts that we faced, where there are a lot of students who require accommodations for things. And that conversation is really being had and trying to figure out how we can, avoid having accommodations to begin with. For example, I think it's around 90% of the students who apply for accommodations at the U of A are requesting an accommodation for a time modifier, right? To have 1.5 or 2 hours to write their exam, which would normally be an hour, right? So now we're having conversations about how can we just not utilize universal design to put a universal time modifier on an exam so students don't have to be putting in these requests to have the accommodation in the first place, right? So a lot of these areas or issues around accessibility are really conversations that are starting to be had, things that were problems before the pandemic, but online learning and the switch back from online to in-person learning have really brought them into the light and shown how big of a problem they are.
Flows really well into my next question, because we've, switching online proctoring and the software used for that, rules around that. Those policies aren't universal. They haven't been used for very long. So it's really hard to, justify their use and say it's a sound policy. So what other kinds of resistance maybe have you seen during the incorporation of technology into the classroom? And, what would you attribute to some of those challenges? Is it that digital literacy is not as high as it could be amongst faculty and or students? Is it that there isn't enough support, or that even the technology used is cost prohibitive? Be really curious to learn more about your situation.
Yeah, I can start off this time. Those first 2 points that you raised, Shifra, around just faculty and being able to understand how to navigate this technological space, I think is really important. It's one of the big challenges. The second one too that you said, it resonated with me. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Challenges at just cost prohibitive technology.
Yeah.
So that
Okay. So
lack of support with
lack of support. Lack of support is another one too, because of the budget cuts. Instructors have been left to be able to do a lot of this on their own and not have TA support or other support to be able to understand how to navigate this technology and make sure that students are supported also in being in this online learning environment. So it's a much more increased workload on them as well, to try to answer some of these questions.
Completely agree with that. I know, for students at the University of Calgary, I'd say sort of technology sort of in two ways. So I'd say firstly, for our Indigenous learners or for students who are coming to the University of Calgary from remote communities, something that we've seen is sort of a lack of high-speed internet access, which has made online learning increasingly difficult for these students and somewhat inaccessible in some cases. Obviously, if you're attending a Zoom lecture or if you're streaming a video or even watching a video that your professor has posted after the fact, you need a certain level of internet connectivity to be able to stream that lecture, to watch that video. So that's definitely a concern that we've heard from students who are coming to the University of Calgary from more remote locations. So I'd say definitely that has been prohibitive to accessing post-secondary education in some cases. The second part of that question, I think, is something more sort of internal to the university and something that the Students' Union requested. So when we were actually looking at the shift back to in-person classes for fall 2021, one of our requests was actually for dual format classes, which means that the professor attends in person and teaches in person, but they're able to stream or able to upload a video of the lecture online. This makes it more accessible to students to attend these classes who might not otherwise be able to attend in person. But it also gives students, the flexibility if they do need to watch a video or they do need to stay at home or to miss a class. So this is something that we requested from the university, but unfortunately, we learned that the University of Calgary doesn't actually have enough of these teaching classrooms and the technology that's associated with them to actually make this happen for students. So I know in the case of some other institutions in Alberta, particularly smaller post-secondary institutions, they were able to offer that option to students because they had the technology to sort of facilitate that dual format class delivery. But unfortunately, the University of Calgary was not able to offer fall 2021. So that's definitely something that we're hoping to work towards in the future. That's definitely technology reliant. But we think that if we could work towards that, it would make post-secondary education a lot more accessible and sort of all of the classes that are offered here at the University of Calgary, making those a lot more accessible to students who otherwise might not be able to attend them.
That gives me an interesting segue, but I will save the question about technology because we have a few questions in our Q&A queue. So Megan asks, what would be the ideal learning setup for you? All in person, all remote, the option of one or the other? Maybe you want to expand on like your own personal preferences, things that you're hearing from students, whether certain scenarios are specific to certain conditions, like whether it's medical issues, whether it's accommodations like you were just talking about, the time extension, Abner. Like I wonder, I think it's a very open-ended question, and there's a lot to be said around like your pedagogical approach to learning here. But I think we've done this long enough to kind of understand what works and what doesn't, and I think we'd love to hear from you on that.
Absolutely. I can jump in first on that one. I think, yeah, that actually relates really well to sort of what I just commented on. But in discussions, I guess I can only speak for the University of Calgary, but in discussions that I've had with the administration here, sort of from my understanding, the ideal delivery format for courses for students, sort of at least in North America, but if not sort of the world over, is actually that dual format option that I was speaking about, because it gives students who value that in-person interaction the opportunity to attend in-person courses and to and engage with their peers, but it also makes it accessible to students who, might not be able to do that, or who might not still feel comfortable, returning to in-person learning, given the fact that we are still in a global pandemic. I specifically here at the University of Calgary, that's an option that's actually offered to some of our professional faculties, and also offered at some of our graduate program levels. For example, our faculty law and our faculty of medicine, a lot of courses, they will actually stream the course content online, but also they'll deliver it in a physical lecture hall. So if students want to attend in person, they have that option. So that's definitely something I know that the University of Calgary is sort of aspiring to, one day, to have that option to sort of deliver both online and in person, that mixed format course content. I guess sort of in my own opinion, and in the opinion of the Students' Union, that is the ideal for students, because it gives all students the flexibility to pick the course delivery format that works best for them. So I think that'd be my take on that question.
All right. Well, oh, sorry, Shifter, did you have a?
Do go ahead.
Point to me. Okay. I have a little bit of a different take from Nicole. I think it really depends on what students are looking for. From what we heard from students at the U of A, it sounds like a lot of them really want to be in person for their learning. I think there are a lot of aspects, even for myself too, I prefer being in person to learn. And I think it's certain elements, for example, being in a classroom and having a discussion. A lot of instructors, when they were online, were deferring the discussions in class to putting forums up on eClass, which is our virtual platform for doing assignments and submitting things and accessing course material. A lot of students would have preferred to have those discussions and ask questions directly and get answers and have that back and forth. So that's a really big part of it too. But I think one other big aspect of it is the experiential learning aspect, and the types of things that we do that are hands-on learning. Students, because the U of A is a research-intensive university, a lot of students who wanted to do research or were conducting research, and having those experiences that they couldn't be because of the pandemic, couldn't be in the lab or do any of that kind of stuff. Really affected them, and it was really an important part of their learning, and also helped facilitate their learning in the classroom. So I think optimally keeping things in person, but also there were students who really loved being able to take their courses online and didn't want to do other things and just wanted to go to class and get their degrees. And I think there's also a space for those students as well.
A really interesting question, I think, that popped up, and then maybe we'll switch gears to more broadly the environment of post-secondary. So yeah, before we do that, how has the value of university versus other online education options such as Coursera and edX changed for you, if at all? Anything that you're hearing? So we're talking about, micro-credentials, open learning, self-directed learning that really doesn't have an attachment to, like a post-secondary credential specifically.
Yeah, so speaking from personal experience, I haven't really taken anything through Coursera. Most of my education has been through the University of Alberta or just through university. So I haven't had a chance to use some of those alternative formats. But maybe Nicole, if you've had the chance to do some of that, you might have some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I know for myself, sort of a similar situation. I've definitely, I'd say, predominantly taken online courses, or sorry, in-person courses up until the start of the pandemic, and then online courses since. I think, just sort of speaking generally here for students, this sort of relates back to what I sort of opened with, in the sense that I think this really boils down to students just want to see their money's worth for the content that they're getting from their courses, and for that actual, learning experience that they're getting from university. So I think, moving forward, I'm definitely hearing from University of Calgary specifically that they are looking into other for course instruction moving forward. So I definitely think that that's something that, whether it's the University of Calgary or the University of Alberta, that they need to take into account is if, they are offering online delivery formats for courses to students, they need to make sure that students are getting their money's worth and they are still getting the benefit out of those courses that they would be if they were attending in person. I think, how to go about doing that is a whole other can of worms, so I won't get into that. But I definitely think that that's something that universities need to be conscientious of, because they need to make sure that obviously students feel that they're getting the value from the courses that they're paying for, also value from their degree as a whole if they are learning online.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, Shifra, to what Nicole was saying, the U of A is also working on developing, we're in the early discussions of our online programming strategy. So coming out of the pandemic and a lot of online learning and seeing that a lot of students found it to be more accessible to access their education, we've been starting to have discussions about what that looks like. Now that we're back into an in-person setting too. And the students who do want to have that online learning element, how can we offer that to them? But also take into consideration all the things that we've learned from the past over the past year, and making sure that we're not making those same mistakes going forward.
Definitely agree with you there. I will use this moment to plug a Coursera course actually offered by the U of A. It's the Indigenous Canada course, which I think is an excellent resource. Dan Levy tweeted about how he was using it. I just put it in the chat. And I think that's like a really great example of, like quality material that is accessible to everybody, whether or not you are registered in a program or looking for a specific credential. Like there's lots of ways to learn that don't necessarily translate to like acquiring a skill. I think knowledge is a great thing to have. Yes. Okay. So now we're going to pivot a little bit to ask some questions around the environment of post-secondary. Both of you belong to institutions in Alberta, and the government of Alberta has laid out some very strong mandates for post-secondary education under the 2030 strategy. And I know that there's a couple questions in the chat that also talk about, tuition hikes, affordability, and maybe we'll get through those one by one. But just initial thoughts on the 2030 strategy and how what you're seeing on the ground is aligning to that, or if there are any challenges.
Yeah, I can start us off with that. So I think, the biggest thing with 2030 is that, it's outlined a lot of really good elements important to emphasize for post-secondary students. It talks about mental health supports, and I know there was some discussion from the Minister of Advanced Education on, supports for stronger policy in relation to sexual violence on campus. That's something that I've heard from the minister himself a few times now. So I think that there's a potentially a really strong framework here in place. My concern right now with 2030 is the fact that the government of Alberta has outlined that they want to form these different working groups with students and with different, student leaders in Alberta. We're still waiting for, further clarification on what those working groups are actually going to look like. Our concern at the Students' Union right now is we just want to make sure that there's going to be, tangible results of Alberta 2030. And we're really looking for that opportunity to work with the provincial government further to sort of implement these things that they've outlined of importance in Alberta 2030. So right now, we're just sort of clarification on that. But I think, Alberta 2030 definitely has the potential to have really positive implications for post-secondary students in Alberta.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Nicole said there. I'll just add on to what she said, and another element that the University of Alberta has really been focusing on is experiential learning. There's been a lot of discussions around, how we implement experiential learning as one of those metrics into every aspect of an individual's degree, and how they can get that experience, not only making it available for them to take, but as a part of their program, integrated within their program. So those discussions are happening, and I think that's also really promising too. I think that experiential learning component is a very important aspect of education, especially if you're going to go to university, and getting some hands-on experience and getting to do research, or getting to be in a clinical placement. Any of those sorts of things are really good for being able to enhance your learning. So I think it's really promising as well.
Maybe combine some of the questions because we have a couple of repeated themes, but Okay, so we have a question around tuition hikes and to what degree is reasonable. Both of your institutions have gone through some significant cuts, and I think it's probably quite challenging to sort of invest in the technology that you're talking about or provide a quality experience when your funding is just not available to do those kinds of things. And so yeah, what are some of the challenges, solutions, approaches that you're taking, to not have tuition skyrocket, and to what degree, I suppose, is it reasonable, as Valerie asks about, and for it to be appropriate to raise tuition in order to support some of these changing needs? Was that all over the place? Should I rephrase that question?
I think yeah, it is a loaded question, but I think I have the general gist. Nicole,
Sounds good. I apologize. I can't remember who's starting us off for that. Is that me? That might be me.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm happy to start us off with that. So yeah, I think you touched points there that tuition increases are sort of a two-part problem. Obviously those come from the institution itself, but here in Alberta, tuition increases has come as a result of provincial post-secondary cuts from our UCP government. So I think, just moving forward, our policy at the Students' Union has always been, predictable tuition increases. We understand that obviously, with inflation and with, CPI increasing, the cost of tuition is not going to stay the same for students forever. We recognize that, and that is, of course, an unreasonable ask. However, what's really detrimental to students is having, 7, 10, 15, 50% increases in a single year. That's just beyond ridiculous, and that's not fair to students because they can't plan. When you start your undergraduate degree, you estimate how much it's going to cost years. However, with the UCP and with the provincial post-secondary cuts that we've seen in Alberta, tuition has just skyrocketed, more so than any other province in Canada. So our concern right now is that, students aren't able to plan, and does have negative and detrimental impacts on students. Students have to take out greater loans, or they have to, work full time. They have to take time off from their degree in order to work to pay for the remainder of their program, which of course, is not something that we want students to have to do. Our advocacy ask has always been to tie the price of tuition to CPI so that students know how much to expect. Something that I'm sure, a lot of students have asked for is, I know when the NDP government was in power, we did have a tuition freeze here in Alberta. So the cost of tuition stayed the same for several years. While that can be a good thing for students, the issue with that is it leads to sort of larger increases after the tuition freeze. So that's why our ask here at the Students' Union has always been of the provincial government to tie tuition increases to CPI so that students can plan for how much their degree is going to cost them and sort of budget accordingly. But yeah, that's been our take. Obviously, the tuition increases here in Alberta have been, monumentally detrimental to post-secondary students. It's had a very negative impact, and it's going to have a very negative impact for a long time on these students as they have to take out larger and larger amounts of loans and incur larger amounts of debt to complete their degrees. But yeah, that's my take on it. So thanks.
I'll be quick, Shifa, so yeah, you have time to get to your other questions too. And it's mostly just building on what Nicole said. But no student's ever happy with a tuition increase and having to pay more for their education. Our policy at the Students' Union is that we always advocate against tuition increases. In the case of exceptional tuition increases as a result of what the budget cuts have been, I think the most important aspect is students might be okay with increases as long as students are consulted on increases and those increases are resulting in quality improvements to their programs, and they feel like they're getting value out of that money. I think part of the feeling of what's been happening is that at least students at the U of A, I felt like the outcome has been a little bit predetermined for them, that they weren't adequately consulted, and that the money is not necessarily going to improving their program. For example, a lot of students have expressed that education is expensive and they want that money to go towards needs-based financial aid, or they want that money to go towards certain equipment they need in their labs or their programs that they don't necessarily have, or it's getting really old. So it's just really about listening to students and what they want. And if tuition has to go up, like Nicole said, sometimes it's necessary with inflation, but it really should, every effort should be made to consult with students and talk to them about what they want to see out of their programs. It is their education, and make sure that we're providing that for them.
Yep, sounds about right. It's definitely been like 5 years since I've been where you folks are, and more things change, the more they stay the same. So, I was there when the tuition freeze was in place, and I have very vivid memories of us asking for the same things that you folks are asking for right now. And my hope is that at some point, some government will hear the validity in that argument. So you had talked about value for, the expenses of post-secondary, Abner, and I think there's some really good questions in here that are asking about, how is value determined when in terms of like the delivery of education. So we have a question talking about, where does the feeling of getting value for your money originate from? Like, is it in the weaker, like if people feel like they're not getting value, is it because they feel like there's a weaker provision of the information or a lack of, robust interactive opportunities when you're offering something online? How do you create an environment that is, it serves equal value to those maybe in a position where you have that dual learning system? If people are online and they're choosing to be there versus people being in person, how do you ensure that both are getting an enriching experience of equal value? And if that has been a challenge, what are you hearing in terms of trying to overcome that?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the biggest challenges is that students, especially over the last year, have been very screen fatigued. Being in front of their screen for, like I was looking at my screen time on my MacBook the other day, and it said, back then I was like 12 to 14 hours in front of my screen, like my computer always being on and being in front of it. So it's really hard to try to create those interactions, right? Because sometimes people just want that person-to-person interaction and to not be on the screen. I think there's definitely ways to try to create that environment online, facilitating spaces where students are working together on assignments, doing things like social events or student life type things are a little bit more challenging to do online because students really want that social interaction person to person. But in an online setting, I think it is doable. And I think, we have to try as hard as we can to try to facilitate discussions in class. Students really like the ability to have instant access to instructors or to other people to be able to ask their questions. And when you're in an online format, you have to send an email to somebody and, hope they respond to you in 24 hours. And for a lot of people because, students tend to be procrastinators, and, they want to get their, they go to the places they need to right away to try to get the answers they need. And to have to wait long periods of time to get responses for certain things makes it really challenging in an online environment.
To add on to that, I think honestly that's the $1 million question, is how to make online learning as engaging and as interactive as in-person learning, because obviously you're working in a completely different medium. You're not in the room with people who you would otherwise be interacting with in person. I'll just give you sort of one specific example of something that we've found to be effective here at the U of C. Something that we were advocating for sort of at the end of August, early September, was to have designated Zoom classrooms on campus. So basically what these are physical in-person classrooms that students can attend and sit in to actually attend their lectures. And this is something that we heard overwhelmingly from students that they wanted, because it gave them sort of that face-to-face in-person interaction with their peers who are in the same class as them. However, they're all seated in the same room attending the same class online. So it sort of gave them that in-person interaction despite having to take an online class. So that was definitely something that we found to be effective. Beyond that, I think just having those opportunities for, engaging with your peers, whether that's, a study group outside of the designated online class, another opportunity to sort of interact in person. I think that that's going to be really key to sort of supplementing the online learning environment, because I know from students it's definitely more challenging to be attending an online class because they're not getting that face-to-face interaction. I'll just add on and say I apologize, but I do have to duck out right at 4 p.m. to discuss tuition increases with the University of Calgary. So just to give you a heads up there. But yeah, I think that that's a really great question, and I think something that we all need to look into a little bit further.
I feel like we have exhausted the Q&A at this point. I don't really see anything new popping up. So maybe I'll just leave it with this last question and also leave it open to folks to share your final thoughts with us. And also want to thank you for joining us and sharing your insight today. So we've talked a lot about, like faculty competency with online tools and digital literacy. One thing that I find kind of interesting is that we're not really talking about student competency with a lot of online programs and softwares. And there's this assumption that if you're young, you just get it. It's like you're the Gen Z TikTok. I'm not Gen Z, but I love TikTok and I'm on there all the time. That there's this natural sort of understanding about how everything works online. And that's actually not the case. And I found peer-to-peer relationships to be really helpful in helping navigate some of that. So I wonder if you hear anything about that from your respective student populations, or if there's anything that the student union does that's more student focused around that. Yeah, and then just give us your goodbyes.
Nicole, I'll let you go first because I know you have to duck out, and then
All right. Absolutely. No, I think that that's a really interesting question, because that's something that I do periodically hear from students. There's sort of this assumption that, they know how to use Zoom, or they know how to use, we use D2L here at the University of Calgary. There's sort of that assumption that students, just automatically know how to use these different technology platforms. So I think that that's definitely something that should come from the university. They should have sort of that ability to show students how to use these technology platforms that, in other circumstances, students might not be as familiar with. I know certain school boards in Calgary, specifically for high school students, they don't necessarily use the D2L platform. So when students actually start at the University of Calgary, they have no idea how to use this platform that all of their courses and course outlines and course material is being posted to. So definitely, I think that should come from the university. They should make sure that students, do know how to access these different technology platforms, and they do know how to use them, especially I think in the circumstance that we are transitioning to a more online learning environment in the future, with more classes and courses being offered online. So I definitely think that that's really important. Otherwise, though, just concluding remarks, I think that we touched on a lot already, but I just wanted to say, thank you so much for having me here today. It was really great to meet everyone and to interact with you both. So yeah, I hope everyone sort of learned something or was able to take something away from this conversation, because I know there's a lot of really, really great questions here to speak to. So thank you very much.
Yes, and speaking from my perspective, I've also seen a lot of students who've come to me, even just friends of mine who also have challenges with just technology in general, not just using specifically Zoom, although there are those challenges too. I do think it's the university has a responsibility to be doing that, and even IST, or Information Technology Services here at the U of A, have done some work to create like picture tutorials for students to try to learn how to use some of these spaces. But I do think there's more to be done. If students don't know where to find those resources, they're never going to be able to figure that stuff out. So you give me some good ideas too, Shifra, of things I can think about going back and how we can better support students in that space. And I guess I'll wrap up by also saying thank you for having me, and I really do hope that all of you got something out of this, and I can take it back to your teams.
Well, I think that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for all of the members who are here and joined us for this conversation. This was a very cool platform to use. You can find, I'm sure, everyone's contact information and their little profile card, and definitely encourage you to reach out to both Nicole and Abner if you have more questions about the roles that they play. Yeah, thanks so much.